Just to mention, I sort of forgot to mention one thing. Let's say you do have, let's say, a basic character model with no texture, or if you're wanting to see everything. If you notice, when you have something like this that has um, the active subtool is basically in normal presentation, and the other subtools are grayed out. This will still be true when you go to do a turntable. So I use something called inactive subtool dimming. If you set it lower and you rotate, you see the other subtools get darker, and it's mainly a way for ZBrush to say, hey, you're focusing on this subtool. You still want to maybe see the others, but these other ones are ones you're not sculpting on, right? It's not so useful when you do a turntable. So usually what I'll do is set this to 1. And then if you click and drag, everything's kind of visible at the same intensity. There's no kind of like temporary masking, right? Now, where that option is outside of my custom interface, I believe is under Preference. I always forget where it is. Preferences. And I think it's under Edit. Yeah, Edit, Preferences, Edit, Inactive Subtool Dimming. So you set that to 1 for your turntables. Okay? An alternative to this, though, so if you don't have that off, there's a system called BPR. So when you're working on your turntables in the viewport, and you're just rendering as is, this is just the basic ZBrush rendering. Now, if you hit BPR, it's actually going to do a lit shaded calculated render with better pixel handling. So sometimes you'll notice, maybe certain renders will look a little jagged or pixelated. That's because it's just the preview mode of ZBrush. And simply just hitting this will give you better quality renders. So just to show you, what I would typically do here is if I am going to use BPR, I would go to Renderer. And if you just want BPR to kind of give you better pixels, a little bit sharper rendering, I would go to Render Properties, and you can turn off things like shadow. You don't need the shadow for this. We don't need transparency. What I will sometimes do is turn on Soft Z and Soft RGB. Basically what they do is they help kind of handle pixels that might flicker in a video. Again, let's say frame my character, hitting F once or twice, depending on which looks better. I'll delete my old turntable. And if you hit BPR, you'll see it kind of pop in and give you the better render, right? Now, if you click so if you don't rotate, it's still in this kind of BPR mode. So as soon as I click and rotate, you see it kind of goes back to this version. Again, you want to make sure you're kind of positioning things the way you like. Hit BPR, okay? Then if you click turntable, each subsequent frame will be rendered in BPR. That's how you can get a higher quality, kind of crisper, slightly smoother, slightly more polished version of that turntable. Yes, it takes a little more time, but the quality is generally worth it. Okay, so again, I'll delete the old turntable. One other thing I forgot to mention for, let's say, non-BPR renders is that you can turn on preview ambient occlusion. I'm not sure if I'm really seeing it on this character. Maybe I'll find one of my other ones here. Yes, if I go back into render and I like to actually have this on now more often than not while sculpting. So you see if I hit this, I'll show you with flat. You go to render, preview AO, turn it on. Oops, maybe I'll do this with skin shade. There we go. Render. Right, off and on. Again, it just kind of helps you see the depth of the sculpting that you're doing, I find. So that's useful. Now, this doesn't work with BPR. So this is for non-BPR renders. So if you want to add a little depth or enhance the look of your models, that's a great way to do it. Let me just see if this thing has color. So again, really, really useful feature for just basic non-BPR. But you see if I hit BPR, I think that goes away. Well, maybe not actually. I thought it did. Okay. Well, anyways, useful, right? So that makes the kind of ambient occlusion rendering faster. So some other things I will often like to do, and I'll show you this in a second. So ZBrush does have a bit of an unusual render system. So we do have this thing called shadows. I'll turn off colorize on this model so we can see this. So you have almost, in this case now, there's roughly 3 broad categories of models. There's one thing called matte caps. Literally, this is like bringing in an image, and you can literally place arrows that face a particular direction that dictate color of the surface, and possibly even some degree of texture. And it just embeds this in a shader that's literally built on these sphere renders. Now, what's interesting about this is that if I go into the light menu and move, let's say the light point here, you see it doesn't interact with this at all. I think until we hit BPR, and then you'll see some lighting and shading based on that angle. Right? So you see that I position this light kind of off to the left in front, and it's kind of casting a shadow. Right? So that's a bit hard to art direct if you're just kind of working in the regular preview mode. However, standard materials, such as any of these, right? If I wanted to art direct and set up something like 3-point lighting, I can do that. And it's a very simple and kind of ingenious system, right? This lighting setup. So you're basically saying, let's say you have a key light here at the upper left corner, kind of 3/4 facing down to the left or to the right. And it's automatically set up this way. Usually your key light is something like 70 to 80% of your overall power, and your fill light is about 30%. So if I click on this second dot, it will now illuminate, and I usually put this to the side. So kind of opposite and parallel or centered. Okay, and then if you hit render with BPR, you'll get this nice kind of shaded render. Okay, so this is if you want to kind of up things even further. Keep in mind the render times will get longer, but if I go to render, I want to show you a few options. Yes. Okay, so the shadows, usually what I like to do with the shadows is actually go into BPR shadows under the render menu. I turn on the global strength, so it almost is sort of like making a fill light effect. And then I'll blur these. So I often like soft shadows, and I feel like the eye generally likes gradients. And so this creates a fair amount of gradient. Now this does, again, increase render time. So I'll increase this to 12, sometimes up to 16 pixels of blur. And if you hit render now, you'll see, I think, a much more appealing look. So again, we're not focused on lighting and shading as much as the model. We have some to make it maybe look a little bit more cinematic or have a little bit more depth, you see? And it's just enough to kind of give it that richness, I think. Okay. Now, like I said, you can use preview AO, ambient occlusion, which again is fairly fast, fairly efficient. Or you can turn on AO, but the actual render ambient occlusion is quite a bit longer. Again, I usually turn on soft Z, soft RGB. And again, these kind of like blur pixels that might be a little bit rough in the render. You can also turn on this thing called depth. It's basically like a depth of field. So again, a little cinematic kind of touch there. One other thing I do turn on from time to time is something called wax preview. So depending on the material you're using, in this case, I'm just using Skin Shade 4, right? But I'll show you what happens. I'll turn off colorize. If you go into the render and turn on wax preview, it's kind of like a very cheap version of subsurface scatter. So if you want flesh that looks like it has some depth, usually this is for fleshy living things. You then go into material, wax modifiers, and I'll just crank it to 100%. And you see it gives it this like kind of orangey, pinkish kind of glow. It's almost like light going into the surface, bouncing around a bit and coming out like subsurface scatter. So it's a very nice effect. And if I show this with that material turned on, right, it looks suddenly a little bit more rich and detailed. Again, 100% isn't always the best, but there's 0, there's maybe 50, there's 100. I kind of maybe like it over 50, so I'll go to like 60, 70, something like that. Okay. I think that looks pretty decent. Again, maybe my preview AO, I'll drop the intensity a little bit because I don't want this kind of shading muddying up the colors too much. So I'll drop it down to a very subtle low amount, like 10, 20. And again, this is, I'll just take a look at this from a side view so we can see it, right? Hit BPR. Now you see how much longer it is just for a single render. Now it's going to take like 5 seconds, 10 seconds a frame, right? So 5 seconds times 300 frames, right? That'll give you a rough estimate of how long it'll take to render. But I do think it looks a fair bit nicer. So if you feel like you've got the time, you can use it. If not, just stick to the regular viewport. Okay? It can look almost as good with minimal to no impacts and render time. Yeah, so here's one I kind of, just to get kind of my own sort of evaluation of the model, I did a little bit of that kind of like wax surface on just like a gray shader. I think it was probably the blend type shader. Again, just to kind of evaluate the depth, the realism, the appeal. And I've had a few other projects where I've basically, just sort of used some of those rendering techniques just to give myself a sense of what this thing could look like in a more professional environment. Same thing with this thing, right? So getting a little bit of paint on and a little bit of that kind of shading as you see the shadows, soft shadows, to help with a bit of a look dev process, right? And there you see my name, my logo. So yeah, it's a good way I think to present your work a professional way. And if you were to send this to a client, in a lot of cases they'd be perfectly happy and probably sign off on the next phase to kind of like, okay, let's make it production ready. Let's advance the textures, right?